Okay.
All right. Emma is an associate tenured professor in the computer science department at Stanford University. Her goal is to create AI systems that learn from few examples to robustly make good decisions, motivated by our applications in healthcare and education. Her lab is part of the Stanford AI Lab, the Stanford Statistical Machine Learning Group, and the AI Safety at Stanford initiative. All right, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I'm so excited to be here. I sort of self-invited myself, so thanks everybody for having me. I was really excited by this topic. And in the spirit of that, I want to start with this quote by David Otter, who many of you know, but is an economist at MIT. And I find this extremely inspiring to think about that the most valuable tools complement human capabilities and open new frontiers of possibility. And I think right now I am a card-carrying computer scientist, so I have to acknowledge that most of the way AI is being used is to automate human activity. But I think this really points to the huge failure of imagination if we limit ourselves by that. So I've always been really motivated in thinking about how can we do better than what humans are doing right now. And I think about sort of trying to do that in systems which intervene. So in particular, a lot of my work comes from the reinforcement learning perspective. But we also try to create systems to help people with things like being better mental health supporters or help people with their physical activity goals. But I'm not going to talk about any of that today, including our education work. I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing to try to sort of surface up when is it useful to even using some of these different tools, and can we provide stakeholders with some additional things in their toolbox that might be helpful when they're thinking about sort of algorithmic decision making. So in particular, I'm going to talk about efficient estimates of personalization effects. So this is, a real coffee cup from Starbucks. We live in America. We love personalization. I take advantage of this all the time. This is probably the best example I've seen of personalization. Maybe you guys can top it. So we love personalization. We love it in lots of fields. We love it in medicine. We love that talking about precision medicine. We love it in education. This is where most of my own application work focuses on. Do we give this student a reading activity? Do we give this student a worked example? Do we give them a problem? We do this all the time in entertainment. And we do this really in an enormous number of areas. So I think the default, and again, being a reinforcement learning person, what I've always assumed is that, of course, we want to do personalized or contextualized decision making. Maybe we can't always, but that clearly should always be the goal. But I think that there's some perils to personalization that are worth considering. So one thing is that often we need a lot more data. We know statistically that the amount of data we need to figure out a personalized policy is generally a lot more than the amount of data we need to figure out a single intervention for everybody. And so that's a really important thing when we are in data-limited scenarios. And so like Hamza was just talking about this example where they did an incredible study and they had around 800 students, which took a year or 2 years and gave us these amazing results. But this is wildly different than the millions of people that we see for many different types of online studies, and where the effects can be very small. So we're often very limited by data. The other is that there's real implementation complexity. So one of the projects I'm involved with right now involves trying to help middle school math students by a hybrid human AI system. And we are training human tutors to do different things with students depending on their state. Like, are they currently disengaged, or are they really struggling with the material? It takes a lot to teach humans to do lots of different things in different contexts. And we have problems with implementation fidelity, which goes to some of the issues that Hannah was bringing up. So really, whether we think of this as software complexity or human decision makers trying to do different things in all these scenarios, this really can have a large implementation complexity. Another is that I think more broadly, personalization reduces shared context. Maybe I love horror movies and my husband loves romance. And so you could imagine that we're close to a world where we could watch The Pit, which I love. If anybody else just watched it, I won't spoil it. But we're both watching The Pit, and you could certainly imagine a more romantic version of that and a more horror version of that. And maybe in the moment, I would like my version a little bit better, but we would have less shared context. And I think that's a real issue in terms of as we build societies and communities, having less shared context is important. There are others that there's real fairness concerns. If we don't give some people vouchers for housing or vouchers for schools, there are real concerns about how hard that is to implement. Now, I will just say, even sort of in the work that we've seen, we also see that personalization does not always matter. Sometimes we'll see that we just find we do personalization, and everybody should, say, get the worked example instead of the video. So sometimes even when we try to do this, there seems to be no benefit. So we are really interested in better trying to understand, can we quantify what is the benefit of going through all the work of personalization and be able to reveal this to stakeholders so that they could decide, is the juice worth the squeeze? Okay, so we're going to frame this in sort of a standard potential outcomes type framework. We're going to think about the specific case where we have historical data. We're going to have a set of covariates, a set of actions. I am a reinforcement learning person. These are the interventions. And we're going to assume some outcomes from some reward or outcome model. Now, I just want to be really clear about when personalization might ever matter. So here's an example. Let's imagine that something, maybe X is age, there are 2 different treatments, and Y is some measure of health outcomes. So in this case, there's a single best intervention. Everyone should get treatment 1, no matter how old you are. And everything has an equal benefit over control. This case has been extremely well studied, which is heterogeneous treatment effects. So now we have that treatment 1 is still the best thing to do, but it is much more beneficial over control for larger X, say older individuals. Personalization does not matter here. The only place where personalization matters is if these cross. So it only matters if there are regions under which it is really better to do one treatment than another. And I say this, and it sounds sort of obvious in retrospect, but I think it's important because heterogeneous treatment effects are necessary, but not sufficient for personalization to matter. Okay, so we could do a test for HTE. If there's no HTE, you don't need to worry about it. There can't be any personalization effects. But even if HTE is positive, personalization might not be worthwhile. Yeah, Hamza.
I guess unless you have a budget constraint, right?
Good question. So yeah, so we're not in this case. So Hamza asked if anyone couldn't hear, like, what if we have like a budget constraint and we want to sort of rank people or others? Not going to talk about it today. I have a paper with Stefan Wagner and others where we thought about if you want to order people and you have budget constraints. And can we look for sort of better or worse ways to do that? Good question. Okay, so what I'm going to assume is that there's an optimal action, which is the best one-size-fits-all to maximize expected utility. I'm going to assume that we know sort of what the distribution of covariates will be in the future. And so we just want to figure out what is the action we could take that would maximize our expected utility. The optimal decision policy would be the one where we could actually personalize for every single set of covariates and then maximize our utility in that case. Again, I'm not doing point-wise. I'm not trying to maximize utility per individual. It's just overall on average. So I'm thinking about it for like a program evaluator. And then the personalization effect in this case is just the difference. So we just want to compare how much additional gain do we get by personalizing compared to using the single intervention. And notice that in general, this always has to be positive, 0 or positive, because even if there's no personalization effect, you could just give everybody the same thing. Now that's if we could know this. As I mentioned before, if we don't have a lot of data, we might learn a bad personalized policy. And so in that case, this actually could be negative. Our null hypothesis is there's going to be no effect. Now, again, I don't mean that there's no effect ever or it's impossible. I'm going to be doing this over a policy class. So I'm going to say our stakeholder says maybe I can intervene on blood pressure level or something like that. I have a class of policy that I'm considering, and I'm trying to think, given that and given the data I have, do I have evidence that if I were to personalize in the future, I would get a gain? Okay, why is this hard? Well, I just want to, this may be obvious for many people in the audience, but I think it's useful to go through. It's hard for many reasons. One is that we don't know the true outcome model. We have to do policy learning and best arm identification as like an inner loop. These are themselves very well studied problems in machine learning and econometrics, et cetera. So this is sort of a sub-problem. And we only have a single data set to do all of this. And in general, we're going to have distribution shift, because I'm going to assume that the data that we have is not the same as what we would have if we deploy things in the future. So it is all the standard challenges of like policy learning and offline policy learning, and kind of nested within this. All right, so this is what we want to do. And we want to do this in a way where we ideally get something that's an efficient estimator. So we get an estimator of this, which has the minimal possible variance. So that's our goal. Oh, I think I had, all right, let me just go through these. Oops. Okay, good. There's a lot of related work on this. In particular, as I said, like there's many people that think about policy learning and policy evaluation. Many of you in the audience have done lots of amazing papers that we reference. I'm not going to talk about almost any of that. I'm just going to talk about the work that is really closely related. So in the healthcare and biostats world, for about 40 years, people have been calling this qualitative treatment effects. And so this could be things like testing for qualitative interactions between treatment effects and patient subsets. And I will just say that, well, as a brief aside, I'm amazed that it's still so hard to connect literature across disciplines right now. The only reason I started to learn about some of the additional papers is because I was giving a talk at LSE in London and I talked to a statistician. I really want the AirPods that translate between disciplines. We don't have them yet. So if anybody knows of literature that I've missed, please let me know. I think there's a huge role for Google Scholar to do better at this. On the other hand, on econometrics, there's been a number of papers that are trying to look at sort of quantities of heterogeneous treatment effects and tests around those. But these are normally kind of more broad and can be applied to a lot of different areas. Things like, conditional treatment effects, looking at the impact of single-sex schooling. And I just bring up these examples too to illustrate that I think many, many disciplines think about this type of area. Okay, and then most recently, this is the work that I got to learn about by giving a talk at LSE. There's been some really nice work by Shi and al, who's a professor over there, looking at this more in the context of the machine learning plus stats community. However, all of these have some limitations. Almost all of them focus on binary actions, and generally where you only have scalar covariates. They're not efficient, and they largely are just decoupled from all the work that happens in machine learning. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the most naive approach you might imagine is what we do is we're going to train models. So we're going to train, I told you there are all these quantities in here that we don't know, things like the reward outcome model, the policies, et cetera. We could just train models of all of these and then plug them in and then try to estimate the treatment effect. Okay, so that's one thing we could do. But this generally will be upwardly biased. I think, in fact, Hamza, has a recent paper talking about this that I'm really excited to read. There's been a lot of different fields that are looking at this issue, whether it's like double Q-learning RL, inference on winners in econometrics, or optimizer's curse. In general, if you use the same data to estimate the impact of a policy that takes a max, it will be overly optimistic. All right, so the next thing we could do is we could imagine splitting our data. So we could split our data and learn sort of our decision policy and our best action and our outcome model on half the data. And for this, we could use things like offline contextual bandits or machine learning or like econometric approaches. So there's lots of ways we could do this learning. And then we could evaluate this personalization effect on the other side. And in particular, we could use something like an AIPW estimator. So,
So the comment you just made about overly optimistic.
Yeah.
The task on which you're evaluating and the task on which you're learning are the same here, right? So, or there's some separate ground truth that you're not mentioning. Otherwise, what does optimism mean?
Great question. So what I mean by being overly optimistic here, I mean that the personalization effect we will get in this case will generally be higher than what the true personalization effect is.
So there's some ground truth which we...
Yeah, so my assumption is there really is some personalization effect in the world that we don't get access to. And this will give us an estimate of it. And in general, if we try to do this estimate and then we evaluate it on the same data where we built these policies, it will be upwardly biased. And so that's what we're going to try to help with by splitting our data. So we sort of learn our personalized policy on half of it, and then we evaluate it on the other. And we're going to use a doubly robust, or we're going to use an ARPW style estimator here, and just plug in all of those different quantities. And that will give us an estimate. And this is also a reasonable thing to do. This will be one of our baselines. And once we have this, we can compute also a p-value from it. Like we can compute an effect size and see whether or not we think we could reject the null that there's no personalization effect. This is also flawed. So why is this flawed? Well, we're learning kind of a lot of our nuisance parameters, like our reward model and our decision policy, all in the same data. But also, perhaps more importantly, like we're losing half our data. So I mentioned before that in general, policy learning, like personalized policy learning, needs a lot more data. And what I've done is I've just thrown out half my data. I'm only using half my data to learn a personalized policy. So that's not going to be efficient. And in general, it's going to be a lot more brittle. And when I talk to my RL colleagues about this, they think this is a terrible idea because they want me to use as much data as I can to learn a good policy in this case. So we're going to do something similar to this, but a little bit different, where we get to try to use all our data. So we're going to call this the k-fold personalization test. And it's going to build on sort of the seminal ideas of double machine learning. Okay, and it's a pretty simple thing to do. I'm going to show you as if there's 3 folds. It doesn't have to be 3. It doesn't have to be the same size folds. We don't use the same size folds. But I think it's clearest to see it here. Okay. So what we're going to do is on part of our data, we're going to learn our outcome model. On part of our data, we're going to learn the best policy and the best action. And on part of our data, we're going to evaluate it. And so this removes bias because we're evaluating on different data than where we learned. But then we're going to repeat this all so that we use all our data. So it's sort of very similar to kind of cross-fold approaches. The key difference here is we're also learning policies and best actions, whereas normally people don't do that. Okay. And then once we do that, we can just average over all of these. Okay, so it's a pretty simple idea here. We do one more thing. So we find in general that when we don't have a lot of data, actually the splits matter. So, if I have education data and like 15% of people do really well and most people, it's kind of a mix, it really matters whether they're in where they are here in terms of my reward outcome modeling, my policy learning, and my evaluation. And ultimately, we want a p-value and we want a good estimate, and we don't want to be sensitive to this. And this has been known as kind of like the p-value lottery if your splits end up making a big difference on whether or not you get something significant. So we do something similar to what was proposed before, and we basically just do this process a lot of times. Okay, so we're going to do S different random splits. And again, I know for some people in the audience who deal with really big data sets, this sounds terrible. I deal with really small data sets mostly, on the order of like hundreds to maybe hundreds of thousands, but not millions or billions or like streaming data from the web. So I think if you have that sort of data, well, A, you probably don't need to do nearly as much of this because they'll be much more stable, but also you don't have to do as many. We do quite a few because it's quite unstable, and we'll see that. So what we do is we do this many times. This is giving us lots and lots and lots of estimates of the personalization effect. And then we compute a single aggregated estimate. And then once we have that, we also compute a standard deviation. And then we get a p-value. And just one thing I want to emphasize here from having given this talk to some other cases is we are not getting S different p-values and then aggregating. We are getting a single p-value, because we do this aggregation before we compute the p-value. And our reviewers asked us to compare to some other ways of aggregating p-values. We've tried that. Most of them seem to be not nearly as good as this because we have a very special structure. The reason we have all these p-value or we have all these things is because we're doing repeated splits. So it's not just like randomly aggregating lots of p-values. Okay, so this is what we do, and this gives us a single estimate, a single aggregated estimate, and it gives us a p-value. All right. We also, yeah?
So your effect size estimate is, each of the things you're aggregating are based on like a third of the sample. So you really don't have the right effect size estimate, right? But you have a good p-value.
No, we have the right effect size estimate too. Yeah, we have the right effect size. So really, and this is kind of a misnomer, we're really getting, for every single data point, we're getting an estimate of the personalization effect, and then we're aggregating across all of them. And so this is showing that we actually use sixfold in the paper, but we end up when we're estimating this is an AIPW estimator. So we get, so we're computing each of these as an estimate of the personalization effect for everything that is
Personalization
one.
effect for a data set that's the full size, you mean?
Yeah, well, each of these is just for that data point, what was the effect, our guess of the effect, and then we end up aggregating it over the entire data set size. So you get the benefit of the full data set.
One day, the question was about the performance may depend on the sample size.
Oh, yeah,
Is that,
yeah.
is that what
Yeah, certainly if you,
Well, that was more like, I mean, each of this, you're training on a very small
Right,
slice
right.
each
Yeah.
time. And then you're not getting, you don't know what would have happened if you had more
Exactly, yeah.
right,
data.
yes. We don't know, well,
If you use
we don't know what would have happened to the nuisance parameters or the policy learning, and we'll have to make some assumptions over how the rates of the policy learner is going. In fact, I'll go to that now. So that might be part of your query.
10 minutes.
Thanks. So what we're going to do is we're going to say what we really care about is the personalization effect. We don't care about the policy we're extracting. We're just trying to understand, is personalization worthwhile? And I'll come back to that. And so we're going to really treat like this reward model, best arm, best policy, propensities, all as nuisance parameters, which is very standard, except now we have this best arm and best policy. And what we're going to prove is that we have zero asymptotic type 1 error under fairly mild assumptions. And then we're going to prove statistical efficiency under slightly stronger. Yeah.
Slightly confused about the psi matrix. So there's the capacity of the policy class, which you said is very important. I mean,
Or we're just optimizing that. We assume that is given. Like the stakeholder says, you get to personalize with respect to DNA and like, I don't know, like the weather or something like that, right? Like it's specified what the covariates are.
I see. So we don't have any control on the capacity of the policy class whatsoever. Like that's
The stakeholder gets to specify it entirely. And then you could do this. In fact, we do it for different types of policy classes.
right, because that would impact the samples required to learn it, and in turn impact the ability to do the cross-fold test, and
Yep.
everything is like linked. And there's also
Or we're going to make, so I think this might be about to be addressed. So we are going to make assumptions on the policy learning, how quickly we can learn one. But aside from that, it's sort of up to the stakeholder or decision maker over what things they could personalize over. And this could be important, right? Like in the sense that there might be there are legal requirements, which means you can't personalize over certain things, but you could use them in your reward model because that's just for prediction versus decision making. And so you could have different covariate classes. All right, what are those assumptions? And I'm happy to talk more about the theory offline. There's a lot of assumptions. Most of them are totally standard. I'm going to highlight the ones that are a little less usual. The one that's a little less usual for the type 1 error is best arm learning needs to be fairly fast. This can be done if you have a gap. So this means that if you really do have one arm that overall yields higher utility than all the other arms, generally we can achieve this. So we have to have fast best arm learning rates. The rest of these are very, very common for double machine learning type approaches. So we need this for type 1 guarantees. This is pretty mild. What do we need for the efficiency proof? We need those plus a couple more things. So one is that we need a consistent personalized policy learner, which means it's asymptotically as we get more and more data, we're going to converge to the best policy in the class. This is a strong assumption. So we need a low regret policy learner. We need one where pretty quickly we converge to a policy that is the best possible in this class. Okay, so this is fairly strong. There are conditions under which this holds. This has been studied in the literature before. If you have kind of, on average, if most people have one intervention that is better than the others, then we can satisfy this. So again, it's sort of like a margin condition on the covariates. If most people have one intervention that is better, and we're starting to think about what if there are ties? What if there are a lot of people for which there's kind of no impact of any of the interventions? Okay, so under these cases, we can prove that we have a statistically efficient estimator. And happy to talk about it offline. We sort of do kind of an Oracle-style proof and then show that using nuisance parameters that we get basically the same rates. Okay, so this is nice. This is the first one to our knowledge. Okay, what can we do with this empirically? So we compare to a couple different baselines. We compare to that kind of train evaluation approach, or I call it twofold, sometimes two, which is just you split the data in half, you learn on one half, you evaluate on the other, and a benchmark method by Shi et al. So Shi et al.'s method does this specifically for 2 actions, and they learn a Kate, and then they can just threshold it. So the policy learning part is easy once you have Kate, if there's only 2 actions, because then you just give it to people if the expected treatment effect for that individual is positive. So bless you, they leverage that structure. Okay, and then they do that both ways, and then they can get a PR. So this is nice. They don't have efficiency, and it doesn't work for other types of structure, but it's a nice and strong baseline. So the reason that we really got into this and that we're really excited about this was because that we think it's applicable to lots of different domains. So I'm not going to be able to go through all the domains right now, particularly because I'm the last thing between you and lunch. But I'm going to tell you briefly about 2 cases of the 4 that we looked at. So one is Job Corps. There's a really interesting data set on job training. Job training, I think, is hugely relevant, particularly right now with what's happening with generative AI. I think, unfortunately, historically, America's done a terrible job with job retraining, is my understanding. Anyone should correct me, but I think generally it's been terrible, unfortunately. It's not great for the future. So this made me optimistic, because this is one of the few studies to show notable benefits on wages, employment, and even convictions and incarceration. So that was pretty exciting. We looked at the data. We looked at the data for about 10,000 people, and looking at monthly wages 4 years after program enrollment. And there was suggestive evidence that it might not benefit middle range individuals. So this was not statistically significant in the earlier analysis, but it was intriguing that the treatment effects seemed to drop. So what we did is we added a synthetic offset just to the 18 to 19-year-olds and made a semi-synthetic data set, where now we know that if we're allowed to condition on age, in this particular setting, there should be some personalization effect. Okay, it should be better not to give it to the 18 to 19-year-olds. There are 12 covariates, and we just are going to use age for policy learning. So this is sort of a nice thing where we can separate between the variables we use for modeling outcomes and the variables we use for decisions. So we compared to the SRP method by Shi et al., train evaluate, we do this train test split, and our method. And this shows you sort of our estimated treatment effect. So it would be around $100 a year. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but people in this population are not making, like people in this study are not making a lot of money. And it's known in America, a lot of people struggle to pay a $400 to $500 bill. So I think that would be substantial. Okay. This compares to the other methods that don't do this don't have the same structure as ours. So they're very sensitive to the splits, and they compute confidence intervals in a different way. And so what this shows is that these are much more variable. And in fact, some of the methods would say there's no benefit to personalization. And some would say, oh, there's over $200 benefit. So these vary substantially. And if we look at sort of the t-statistic that we're computing, again, we get huge variability. If we do this, we're averaging over 100 splits. If we look at the estimates they have across the 100 splits, it varies a lot. And again, this sort of train evaluation baseline would say, hey, don't bother in a lot of cases. Okay, so I think this just suggests the estimator that we're producing is much more, it's much more stable, and it can consistently find the effect that we expect. So another case we looked at was depression treatment. This was a clinical trial that was published in 2000. This again sort of shows often a reason, the size of data sets that might often be happening. This was about 650 people. There were 50 baseline covariates, and we were looking at rating scales for depression. And here there were multiple different interventions. So you could either have nefazodone or psychotherapy or both, or there could be a control. And here, so the prior work had suggested there is no effect. There's no benefit to personalization. People who had done personalization found that everybody should get the combined effect. combined policy. And we also get that estimate, that essentially we estimate that this is going to be 0. The she and all method sort of varies, but mostly agrees with us. But the trainee-eval split is really variable. And this would certainly, like +8 would be a big difference. So you would not want to be making a decision of, yes, we should definitely personalize and maybe not give, one of these interventions to people because we're really seeing this big effect, when in reality, this would not be very trustworthy. Okay, and again, we can see over here that there's just like this enormous range of, they're just not very stable for these other estimates, and they go above and below the critical value of where you might want to say there's a personalization effect a lot. So I think there's a lot of really interesting directions for future work. The data partitioning ended up mattering a lot. That seems like that should just be a hyperparameter or not matter at all. But we found that matters quite a bit in these cases of how do you use which data for learning versus which data for evaluation. And I'd love to talk to other people if they find that in their data. We also find the policy learning matters, not hugely across classes, but just the methods that you use, like better policy learning is helpful. And I think there's just lots of interesting extensions too to sort of more high dimensional actions. We've been talking about how like the parameterization of the actions, like what Hannah was talking about, really matters. And so extending this to sort of really high dimensional action spaces or language would be really cool. But I just want to sort of close by saying, I think one of the nice aspects of the test and the estimator we're proposing is that it can immediately inherit from all the great work that's happening in policy learning and evaluation. I always think it's great when we can reduce one problem to other problems. It means I can build on more great work that's happening in the community. So you can just algorithmically, all of that work can just be plugged in here. But I think that ultimately, even before we get to all the later work, these sort of policy decisions are being made constantly. And so having a sort of tool like this that can provide a principled way for intervention decision makers to decide if personalization has real value could be really helpful. Thanks.
We don't have time, but maybe one more question. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yes, this is really cool. So like the motivation of dealing with these kind of like small sample sizes where like you would struggle to sort of like resolve heterogeneous effects, like that really resonates with me. And I'm curious how you see this play out sort of like in the empirical results in small sample sizes. Like, so in theory, you need the sort of fast rate basically on the policy learning, right? And if the sample size is such that like it would be difficult for you to like learn a good personalized policy, right? Like I think a lot of RCTs are in that range where they're kind of like not super well powered to find heterogeneous effects. Then does this show up as, for example, like underestimating like the potential value of personalization? Like in that regime, you don't have enough samples to find the right policy or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So one thing also, a lot of my HCI colleagues tell me is they're like, we want to know how to design our experiments to detect if there's a personalization effect. And this does not answer that. I think we certainly find empirically that we don't have to necessarily satisfy, we don't have to have particular policy classes or assumptions where we think these rates are satisfied to be able to detect cases where things are positive. I think it's pretty robust to that part. What it means for designing, I think, is an interesting open question. I think the other thing that's sort of a big open question to me is that if you find that personalization matters, what policy do you deploy? So in general, across the splits, and even across the folds, you're going to learn different policies. And so would you feel like, oh, well, if I learn 17 different policies and I know there's a personalization effect, am I comfortable deploying any of them? Because you're not really sure what the right personalization should be there, and maybe then you'd learn on the whole set, or you do an additional experiment.
Nice, thank you, Emma. Yeah, you're allowed to clap, I feel like. Okay, there's like a lot of I was like, you can. So now it's lunch. Like I said, so there is a catered lunch outside for those that want it. I think it's Indonesian food. But also, if you are also free to leave the building, we're going to start again at 2 on the dot. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Because food is strictly prohibited in this room.
You are not allowed to come back in here.
So we should.
Oh, the second floor. Outside is usually where people eat. So there's tables all around the perimeter of the Simons Institute.
If you're an East Coaster and want to stay inside.
For unknown reasons, if you are attached to the indoors, the second floor has a cafeteria. Yeah, there's also some like tea, I think, up there, water. Some bubbly water. Yeah. All right. See you guys at 2.
That's super interesting. Oh, you have a question too? Oh, yeah. Sorry.
I actually was going to ask her.